This summer of learning, SHRM is offering 20% off HR essentials, including the SHRM learning system and specialty credentials. Whether you're charting a course towards advancement or leading executive strategy, grab your passport for career growth with code SUMMER25. Learn more at shrm.org/summer25. Offer ends September 1st.
Quick question. How would you define what makes a good job? Is it the money you take home at the end of the day? Would it be the ability to work with smart, friendly people for a cause you care deeply about? Or maybe it's a flexible schedule allowing you to spend more time with your family or to pursue your passions. What about feeling respected and valued at work? Does that top your list? Well, we recently asked our audience here at SHRM the same question. What qualities make a job truly great? And we received some insightful responses. Now, before we read some of their answers here, I just want to acknowledge that yes, we're starting things off a little differently for this week's episode. In just a few minutes, our guest this week and I will be having an important conversation around what matters most to today's wide range of workers, why it's important for employers to understand their different needs, and what you can do as a workplace leader to build a more resilient and motivated workforce to drive those important business outcomes and ultimately help more of the people you work with feel they've got a good job. So be sure to keep tuning in. So Aubrey from California said what makes a good job is proactive communication, attention to detail, thorough review before completion, asking questions as needed, completing upon or ahead of deadline. Understand that, Aubrey. All right, Nikki from Arizona said, competitive pay and benefits make a good job, strong work-life balance and paid time off, hybrid work environment, people-focused culture, learning development and growth opportunities, and a challenging and fulfilling work. And finally, Emily from Virginia it said, a good job is one where I can use my talents and skills to do meaningful work and where I feel my work is appreciated. Emily, I think we can all relate to that. That appreciation is expressed by my employer in the form of competitive salary and benefits. Let's switch gears to talk about what this means on a larger scale. In today's competitive global labor market, the idea of a good job is being redefined. Recently, SHRM released a report titled What Global Workers Want and the Global Worker Experience. SHRM surveyed workers globally across all types of roles, from full-time salaried employees to independent contractors, to uncover the top job features they value most. Here's what we found. Good pay and benefits and a fair, respectful work environment are the top two priorities for workers worldwide. But here's the catch. While over 80% of these workers say these features are very or extremely important, only about 40 to 60% are satisfied with their current jobs in these areas. Now, I mentioned earlier we have an expert to discuss how organizations can use these findings. Here today, we have SHRM researcher Jenny Perez, who led the research on what global workers want and the global worker experience to discuss some insights and ways to apply this data. Jenny, welcome to All Things Work.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're excited to have you. All right, so at the start of this episode, I shared just a few findings of what our audience defined as a good job. And the report focuses on the different workers here, types, the salaried, hourly, part-time, temporary, and independent. There's a lot of them, so I would love to dive right into it. So from your perspective, how do workers' definitions of a good job, differ across these different work types?
Yeah, so when we look at what workers of each type value, we asked across all workers across the globe 17 different job features. So kind of what's important, what are you most looking for in a job? And regardless of worker type, we really see a lot of convergence on really four main job features. And so all workers can get behind good pay and benefits. Obviously, that really rises to the top as a top job feature. One that we also see is that workers really value a fair and respectful work environment. And then we also see that workers across all types really want job security and job stability, and then the flexibility to manage both life and work issues. And so those are kind of the universal things that all global workers say are really important to them. And those kind of aren't too surprising.
Right.
But where we see some interesting things are with full-time salaried employees, temporary employees, and independent workers. They actually really highly value the opportunity to use their skills and abilities.
Mhm.
And this is interesting to see that across those three worker types, because those in our sample are also, they have the highest educational attainment. And so it kind of makes sense that they're looking for jobs that align with their knowledge and their experience. Something also interesting that we see unique to full-time hourly employees and part-time employees is that they really highly value having a manageable workload. And so what's interesting is that these two worker classifications reported that they are in person or on site the most. And so it kind of makes sense that people who are going in person for work are looking for a manageable workload so that, the physical and mental demands of the job are more manageable. And so it's really interesting to see how there are some different job features that are converging across all the 5 worker types, but some that are really kind of unique to each one.
Exactly. I was going to say, when you started off with those types of desires, I think a lot of us can relate to that. The fair pay, balanced workload, the flexibility, no matter where you are in the world. I think a lot of people can relate to that for sure. So yes, I think going back to just, the overall definition of a good job, I think a lot of us can relate to that when it comes to fair pay and respect and the workloads. But you mentioned some of those more unique definitions of what makes a good job. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? What that might look like for the different types of workers?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's really interesting to see. There's a great chart in the report that kind of maps out all the different job features by worker type. And so one thing that's really interesting that we see is that 4 of the 5 worker types, so everybody excluding independent workers, really place a high value on having a good relationship with their manager. And so it kind of makes sense that we don't see independent workers in that mix because they're often their own boss or running their own business, so they might not have a manager necessarily. But it really kind of highlights that for, everyone else, full-time salaried, full-time hourly, part-time workers, temporary workers, that it's really important to have effective people managers to, set the culture and set the morale at work. So looking at where there's some unique findings amongst the worker types, looking at independent workers specifically, they're the only workers that within their top 5 most important job features to them that place an emphasis on jobs that have personal meaning to them.
Right.
And so that's not to say that it's not important to any of the other 4 worker types, of course, but it's not in anybody else's top 5, but it was for independent workers. And so that really kind of highlights how, independent workers really find a lot of intrinsic motivation and fulfillment in their work, and that's something that's really important to them. Also because when we ask them, do you see your job as just a means to earn money or, a part of who you are? Independent workers, out of all the worker types, said that their jobs are really a part of them. They see it as more than just a means to earn money. So that's a really interesting finding.
And it makes sense too. I think a lot of us would understand that as well. And the report highlights a significant gap between what workers value and how satisfied they are actually in areas such as pay, flexibility, job security. So how does this gap exactly play out differently for a variety of workers here?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, those are kind of universal elements to a really good job. A lot of workers can get behind good pay. They got to support their livelihoods. People want to be treated with dignity and respect and want to have a secure job. And so a lot of the global workers, 80% or more of them, can get behind those being really important.
Right.
But where the big gaps are is that when we ask them how satisfied they are with those different job features, really we only see about 40 to 60% that are very or extremely satisfied with those job features. And so you have these workers who are saying, this is something that's really important to me in a job, but I'm not actually really getting that. And that's an area where employers can really target to improve things for workers.
That leads into my next question. We want to close this gap. I think all employers would love to do this. So what are some ways that employers actually can address this gap and try to close that?
It's a great question. And sometimes it feels like it has to be this monumental effort. And really, it's important to recognize that all workers want good pay and good benefits, but it's also not totally feasible for employers to completely overhaul their total reward systems. You can't just give everybody a raise. There's not always the
Why not?
resources. I know, right? Yeah. If only it were so easy. But really what employers can do and HR leaders is look at benchmarking data and look at industry standards. And especially for companies that are multinational, looking at how those industry and benchmarking data differ by country or by region that you're operating in. And so, it might not always be that you can totally overhaul your total rewards package, but, small improvements and being able to stay up to date with how other organizations are doing as well is really important. Another recommendation, so workers of all types really value a fair and respectful work environment. And people just want to be treated with dignity and treated with respect. And that's something that's a very easy, minimal effort, low cost intervention to do, of just recognizing the human being that's in front of you and having managers have the proper training and resources to, build psychological safety and lead with inclusive behaviors so that everybody can feel this, positive and fair environment.
And so mental health is also a growing concern for workers of all job types. Again, I feel this report is so relatable because I think no matter where you are, mental health is so vital for your everyday workplace. So how might these mental health challenges, of one type of worker differ from maybe the other? Because like you said, they're facing different types of challenges.
Absolutely. Mental health is huge, and it's such an important conversation that has been taken to the international and global level as well. So the World Health Organization, the International Labor Organization, these big associations that, have really big global presences, really recognize the importance of mental health at work. And so one thing to consider, whether one person's job is negatively or positively impacting their mental health, is looking at what is driving that. And so part of this research, we did a driver analysis to see, what's really driving people's perceptions of their mental health at work. And really the only factor that stood out consistently across all worker types was recognition for doing a good job. And that's really the one kind of element that we see that all workers can get behind, that's something that's really important to their positive mental health at work. So that's a really easy way for leaders and employers to just, recognize and appreciate the efforts of their employees. Because again, they're human beings. The SHRM government affairs team takes this research onto the global stage as well to advocate for, more national policies and things that make jobs and work for all. And so it's really important to keep that conversation going and recognize what kinds of things might be negatively impacting workers' mental health.
Right. Our government affairs teams are nonstop working. So you mentioned, different ways managers and teams can really help these different types of workers. What other policies do you think that they could really utilize to create this change?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that in terms of policy recommendations, a lot of the stuff actually comes at the national level. And so, local, state, and federal governments. And our government affairs team does a great job at advocating internationally at different convenings of world leaders to talk about how we can really target these policies at the national level. And so organizations, again, like the World Health Organization, also have a lot of resources on different kind of policies that, are maybe not ones you might think of to target mental health, but that really do help improve things. So things like worker safety and regulations and worker protections. Those are things that create physically safe environments for workers, but also mentally safe environments for workers. And these are things that, again, are targeted more at the national level. But there's also things that employers or organizations can do, which is, ensuring widespread access to upskilling and reskilling. Something we might get into is about how workers really value the opportunity to learn and to grow and to advance their careers. And so being able to have, accessible upskilling initiatives and, training programs are things that can impact or make a positive impact on people's mental health by just giving them the opportunity to learn and to grow.
Yeah, it makes them feel valued.
Exactly.
So, and we know that when it comes to burnout in the workplace from those mental health challenges or those heavy workloads, as you mentioned before, retention becomes a big challenge because we found with over half of workers who rated their job quality low, they were actively job hunting, according to the report. And now, it's not a very surprising thing, but the number itself shows how much of an impact this is making. So what are the key takeaways and steps for HR leaders looking to improve their retention efforts?
It's a great question. And it's such a staggering stat to see that over half of people who rate their job quality as low are job seeking. So the good news is that when you look across all global workers, only about 13% of them rate their job as low
Mhm.
quality. So it's not all doom and gloom, but there are some workers who, are also still rating their job qualities as average. And so there's a lot of
Mhm.
opportunity for improvements. So a big takeaway for employers also is that their current and former employees are ambassadors for that organization. And
Mhm.
so when it's really important to consider how workers are perceiving their job and the job quality, because they really set the reputation and expectations of that organization. And that's true also for independent workers who technically might not be working for an organization or have a boss, but can also set the reputation of gig work and of self-employment. And so an important consideration for organizations about retaining workers is to look at the job features that workers say are impacting, their perceptions of job
Right.
quality. And so, not surprisingly, again, pay and benefits, really top
Right.
of the list. But so are opportunities to use your skills and abilities,
Yeah.
opportunity to do work that is meaningful to you. And again, having learning and development opportunities. And so a key takeaway for HR leaders and employers is that ways to address these in the organization to retain these employees is to be able to internally match people to, there's certain skill sets to different projects. And that
Mhm.
might be cross departments or cross collaboratively. And just also asking your people, what drew them to the organization, what drew them to the mission, and, kind of understanding what makes work meaningful to them and how, future initiatives can really build on that. That's how you really get that buy-in from your workforce.
Exactly. And we talked about feeling included in those opportunities to use their skills or feeling valued for that new skill development, learning and development type program for these workers. But it could really be different for those temporary or part-time workers. So how does the experience of inclusion in this really differ for these types of groups of workers?
Yeah. So just as some kind of brief context here, in the report, again, there's these 5 different worker classifications. And so part-time workers we're defining here as workers who work part-time for an organization, less
Hmm.
than 30 hours a week. And temporary employees are people who are in temporary positions that might be more like limited time or project focused. And so when we look at both of those 2 samples of part-time workers and temporary workers, what we see is that part-time workers, amongst our sample at least, the group skews a little bit older. So this has the
Okay.
highest share of workers who are over the age of 50.
Hmm.
They also tend to be, on average, higher proportions of female workers in this
Hmm.
worker type. And so when we ask them, why are you working part-time, the top 2 reasons they give are the flexibility of the schedule and caregiving responsibilities. And so it's really important to consider, okay, so what's important to those people? And so for part-time workers, what might make them feel more included are things like flexible work arrangements,
Hmm.
more remote work options, flex time during core work hours, and just generally, cultures and environments that are more supportive and understanding of caregivers. And that's a never pressing issue that SHRM Thought Leadership has done research on, that government affairs advocates on a lot as well. And so understanding who kind of make up part-time workers is one way to kind of target how to make them feel more included. And then looking at the temporary employees, these people who are, maybe working on project-based assignments or more seasonal work, we found that this group has the highest share of workers who are aged 18 to 34, so it skews much younger.
Hmm.
And that makes sense when you think about, workers in this age band who might be working seasonally or kind of
Exactly.
alongside, education
Hmm.
things that they're working on. And so when we ask them why they're working in a temporary job, the top 2 reasons that they gave us were that they hoped actually would lead to a long-term job,
Hmm.
and that it was the only work that they could find. And so what's fascinating actually is also 77% of temporary workers would prefer to have a job that was long-term, and that would make sense. And so this group is highly educated, and so over half of them have an undergraduate degree. And so this kind of suggests that for some of these temporary workers, at least, that their educational attainment isn't resulting in the kind of job placement that they want. And so they're in a bit more of a precarious situation. And so to have these workers feel more included at the organization, you really need to align their skills to the opportunities that are available. That might not always be an open role, but it's also very important to consider and leverage each other's professional networks. And so if you
Hmm.
have, a temporary worker or a seasonal worker and something's not available at the end of their project, but maybe you can connect and have them placed into a more full-time role that they're looking for.
And just to remind our audience, global. This isn't just the United
Right.
States, talking about the United States, labor market and the fluctuations we've been seeing and the challenges we've been seeing. You're talking about this is global. So a lot of people in all these different countries are experiencing these issues as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a great point. I'm sure this all resonates very much with our U.S. audience.
Yeah.
And we did sample.
We're not alone.
Right,
Here,
exactly. Yes, but this project was a very large, multinational effort. So we surveyed 16 countries
Mhm.
and 1,000 workers within each country. And so we really tapped into all the geographic regions across the globe to capture these insights. And so a lot of it will resonate, but is also something that we're seeing in multiple countries.
Easy to say this was taking up a lot of your work. We're going to talk about a heavy workload. You had a big one on
Yeah.
this one. So I'd like to move on to another round of questions to get your hot take, to talk briefly about some misconceptions around all this. So the report shows while pay is very important, we talked about that, it's not exactly the whole story. It's not painting the full picture here. So can you explain what other factors workers value just as much, if not more?
Absolutely. So it's interesting that you see good paid benefits as number one for about half the countries, about 8 of them out of the 16. But that means there's another 8 that's not number one. And their number one is a fair and respectful work environment.
Mhm.
And so really those are the top 2 job features that workers across the globe are saying this is something that's really important to us and that we're really looking for in a job. So yes, good paid benefits, absolutely crucial. You need to support your livelihood, to support your, your current and your future needs. But it's really also important to just treat people with respect and have a very, fair work environment.
So just looking at this report from kind of maybe the audience perspective, not the researchers, it can be easy to assume part-time workers may not prioritize, that skill development or that career growth. So, what is that? Can we break that misconception a little bit here with the research you have?
For sure. It's a good one because there's so many misconceptions about part-time workers just by the nature of how many hours they work.
Yeah.
But when you look at the job features that actually drive their positive mental health perceptions at work, the top 5 for part-time workers, 4 of the 5 of them are the exact same as full-time salaried workers. And so that's a good relationship with their manager, recognition for doing a good job, a manageable workload, and career advancement opportunities. You also see an opportunity to do work that's meaningful to them. And so 4 out of 5 of those are the same for part-time workers as they are for full-time salaried employees. And so really workers value many of the same things. And so it's not just about how many hours they work. It's important to offer, opportunities for reskilling and upskilling and recognition to all kinds of workers.
Thank you for clarifying and clearing up those misconceptions, Jenny. That's so important to have. So before we wrap up the conversation, I'd love to get your hot take in a quick 60 seconds or less for the next 3 questions to get your final thoughts. It's like a speed round.
All
You
right, let's
ready?
do it.
Okay. What's one data point from the report that really shocked you?
So one thing that was actually really surprising was that independent workers both rate their job quality as higher than other worker types and had rated that their jobs had a more positive impact on their mental health than any other worker type. And so I know I'm supposed to keep this brief, but it's really staggering. They're not just like a couple percentage points. It's like 15 to 20 percentage points higher than other worker types. On some of
Okay,
those.
so that's a significant number.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So next question. In your opinion, what's the most overlooked factor that contributes to worker happiness?
Yeah. So thinking about just recognizing and appreciating, again, the human being in front of you, I think is really important.
Agreed. All right, last one. Calling it one small change. What's the one tiny step employers could make tomorrow to meet workers' future needs?
One small step. I think it really starts with just something as minimal as, a brief announcement or email to your workforce. And this one I'm going to target specifically about upskilling and reskilling, which is so important. But even just encouraging your workforce to say, take 5 minutes to talk to your manager or talk to a colleague about something that's interesting to you and that you're interested in learning about. And that can just start conversations about, resources and different things to access to upskill.
All right, thank you, Jenny, so much for just, diving into this research. I know there was so much more we could have come into. We could have talked for days about this, but thank you so much for clarifying those misconceptions and running us through, the really shocking data that came from this report.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
Love a great conversation. If you enjoyed our conversation today, be sure to subscribe wherever you enjoy your podcast so you never miss a new episode. Also, did you know All Things Work is more than a podcast? That's right, we're also a weekly newsletter that includes in-depth articles and the latest research from SHRM to keep you in the know. Just head to shrm.org/allthingswork to sign up. Plus, follow SHRM on social media to view the latest clips and join the conversation on game-changing topics that are redefining the world of work.
Unlock 20% off SHRM educational programs this summer of learning. Use code SUMMER25 and take off in your HR career. Learn more at shrm.org/summer25. Offer ends September 1st.
SHRM.